Hello everyone and welcome to Eternalism in a Nutshell. My name is David and the title of this episode is If Only I Had Known Then in 2004 What I Know Now in 2023, Part 4. This is Episode 4. We ended the last episode with the warning from a former KGB agent who defected from the Soviet Union in 1970 and was interviewed in 1984 pertaining to what he viewed as the takedown of America from within, and in 4 strategic and progressive stages: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization. Dr. Steve Turley gave us some interesting commentary on these 4 stages, and as to what he clearly recognized as this cultural Marxism and woke activism that has emerged out of the universities and infiltrated nearly every institutional and cultural aspect of our lives, including our religious lives as active and believing Latter-day Saints. I thought it would be helpful then were I to give some commentary myself on these 4 stages in the takedown of America and Western civilization by applying each of these 4 stages to race Marxism and climate Marxism. The first thing to note about race Marxism is that it bears no resemblance at all to Martin Luther King's civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, whose nonviolent slogan was, "Speak truth to power," which contrasts sharply with the Black Lives Matter slogan of, "No justice, no peace." Notice that both movements played out according to their various nonviolent and violent slogans. With that said, let's speak of the demoralization stage of race Marxism, with its claim of systemic racism and white privilege. Now, it's not hard to imagine the demoralization that takes place among the citizens of a nation that has been declared to be systemically racist, meaning systemically unjust, irredeemable, and incurable. Now add to that demoralization the notion that this systemic racism expresses itself as white privilege, meaning that every advancement that a white person, family, school, church, business, or institution has achieved or benefited from throughout America's history is dismissed as ill-gotten gains at the racist expense of people of color, and is further disparaged as being no more than white privilege. Now, if you take the racial makeup of the United States, we discover that in 2010, 63.8% of the population was white, and in 2021, 59.3% were white. This means that according to this race Marxism, that in 2010, 63.8% of the U.S. population were racist bigots, and in 2021, a slightly less 59.3% were racist bigots, and that this racism and bigotry is systemic, meaning that there is no getting away from it. And so we have self-loathing white people who have bought into this race Marxism and propaganda, doing penance and walks of shame for being white people. Now, how demoralizing, destabilizing, and insane is that? And so, this takes us to the destabilization stage, wherein race Marxism has strategically and maliciously turned anti-racism into anti-whiteness, meaning racism in reverse. Now think of not only the demoralization, but destabilization that comes from viewing approximately 60% of the population as not only being racist bigots, but as racist targets for a new anti-racist campaign of anti-whiteness, and which is allowed and even encouraged to express itself in the most outlandish and racist of ways. For example, consider which of these 2 posters taped to a traffic pole is considered to be a message of racial hatred. The first of which reads, "When you date a white, it's not all right." And the second of which reads, "It's okay to be white." Now, if you guessed the second message, you would be right. For the UK press recently declared that "it's okay to be white" as a racial hatred message, sending the demoralizing and destabilizing message that it is not okay to be white. You see then how this Marxist social conflict theory works, for it is continually creating conflict to not only demoralize the population of the country it wants to collapse, but to destabilize it as well, by dividing the population into two conflicting groups, the oppressors and oppressed, and then justifying and egging on the oppressed group into violent protest and conflict against those who have been branded the oppressors, who in this case are white Americans. And any attempt to push back against these outlandish claims and outrageous actions of these cultural Marxists by offended white Americans is considered by these woke activists to be even more proof or evidence of their white privilege and racist bigotry. And this is why even the soft-pedaled attempt by reasonable Americans to declare that it is not just black lives that matter, but that all lives matter, was met with such swift resistance and was not to be tolerated. For the conciliatory days of Martin Luther King were over, and things have now destabilized to such an extent that we are rapidly moving toward a race war in America, wherein the reality will be that no lives matter, which takes us to the crisis stage of this subversion model, which, by design, calls for ever more drastic and divisive solutions, such as governors standing down and allowing protesters to riot, loot, and burn down the community with no repercussions, and as a form of appeasement or penitence. And speaking of appeasement and penitence, consider the recent antics of California Governor Gavin Newsom, pushing for reparations for descendants of slaves now living in California to the amount of $230,000 per descendant. This is not just fiscal madness, but cultural madness as well. And yet, black activists are not satisfied and are calling for $350,000, and under the assumption that $230,000 is just the starting bid. And of course, it doesn't really matter whether Governor Newsom can deliver to these black activists these longed-for reparations, for he is merely setting himself up for a run at the presidency in 2024, and he desperately needs to put out the idea to the black community and to these black activists that if he wins the presidency with the help of the black vote, that these slave reparations could become a reality and is part of appeasing the latest crisis in America. The bigger crisis, of course, would be the Mad Max reaction of the approximately 80% of white and non-white citizens who would be up in arms were such slave reparations even attempted to be paid out to the black community. This then leads us to stage 4 of this subversion model, which is referred to as normalization, wherein all the above, the demoralization, destabilization, and crisis mentality, becomes the normalized status quo or state of affairs that Americans must come to live with as the new norm. In other words, the dystopia of living in an America that no longer believes in equal justice under the law, but which now sees systemic racism and white privilege as cause for reverse discrimination, and of course, eventually cashing in on all this cultural madness and anti-whiteness propaganda through slave reparations to the black community, and amounting to no more than another Marxist redistribution of wealth scheme. Now, with all that having been said about race Marxism, we can now turn to climate Marxism, wherein the same destructive pattern or subversive model is in play. Beginning with demoralization, wherein these climate Marxists and woke activists insist that the immediate cause of the coming climate change apocalypse, with its warming seas, melting ice sheets, and rising sea levels, is not to be attributed to natural causes such as volcanic eruptions, but rather to the overpopulation and overconsumption by ordinary people like you and me. The implication is, of course, if there were far less people and far less consumption of resources, there would be far less of a climate problem. And if protecting the planet is one's number one concern, then under this hypothesis, people and their consumer-driven lifestyles become the number one problem. And this is particularly acute in the highly industrialized societies of the West, such as the United States. Now, the demoralizing and destabilizing effect in the West that takes place when people are indoctrinated into believing that they are the problem and that their capitalistic and consumer-driven lifestyles are the cause of climate change and the end of the world is bad enough. But when this climate hysteria and woke activism is transferred to our school children, who are indoctrinated at school to believe that it is not people who are the problem, but rather adults, can be very demoralizing and destabilizing at once, not to mention a very disturbing form of child abuse. But let's move on to the destabilization stage of this subversion model, wherein it has been decided by these climate Marxists and woke activists that if people and their consumer-driven lifestyles are the problem, then deindustrialization is the solution. This Marxist anti-West and anti-human deindustrialization of the West, in the name of saving the planet, is both sinister and brilliant. For if the gullible people of the West can be persuaded that it is their moral imperative to both impoverish and despoil themselves in order to save the planet, and that the best way to do this is through deindustrialization and government intervention, then what need is there for an outside military force to get involved? There isn't one, and with both the demoralization and destabilization stages already complete, or at least in play, then it is time for the third or crisis stage to take place. It shouldn't surprise any of us who are familiar with cultural Marxism and woke activism that at the height of the climate crisis, the topic of climate justice would come up. For while climate Marxism has been used to take complete control of the energy industry through the threat of carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions, it can now be used to redistribute wealth from the developed countries, like the United States, Canada, and Japan, to the developing countries, like Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The argument is, of course, that these developing countries are suffering from the disastrous and impoverishing effects of climate change, but not the benefits of industrialization. And so it only seems right, or fair, or just that they be compensated by those industrialized countries who are the primary source of the CO2 emissions. This, of course, is just another Marxist redistribution of wealth scheme that puts even more power and money into the hands of the cultural Marxists, whose ultimate goal is to take down Western civilization by any means possible, including the lies, propaganda, and hysteria associated with climate change, along with the immediate suppression of any and all so-called climate deniers. And even if these so-called climate deniers are well-established and renowned scientists and climatologists. Given the seriousness of this climate Marxism, I would like to present a 12-minute compilation of clips from Dr. Jordan B. Peterson's nearly 2-hour interview with Dr. Richard Lindzen, who is just one of those well-established and renowned scientists and climatologists who has been effectively silenced by these climate Marxists whose intent is to take control of the energy industry and de-industrialize Western civilization, and all under the guise of saving the planet from the warming effects of CO2 emissions.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to continue today my inquiry into the fraught realm, let's say, of climate science, the so-called settled climate science. I'm talking today to Dr. Richard Lindzen. He's an accomplished professor, atmospheric physicist, and meteorologist, having authored over 200 scientific papers and contributed to landmark theories in the realm of ozone photochemistry, atmospheric tides, and most recently, climate stability. His academic degrees are all from Harvard University. The first thing we're going to determine before we dive into the topic at hand is why it might be reasonable and important to listen to Dr. Lindzen.
I mentioned, I had 2 papers that appeared in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society that dealt with climate and my objections to the current narrative in various ways. And they got published, they got reviewed, but in both cases, the editor was fired immediately. And
that's cute.
I mean,
that was when?
Well,
when did that happen?
One was 2000. One was 1991 or 2, and the other one was.
So you were on this early.
Oh, well, this issue actually began in the 60s.
Right.
And it was clear there was a lot of hunting around for some environmental issue that would give people power on the over the energy sector. And so, you had Earth Day in the early 60s, but then you had global cooling, and the villain there was...
That was the 70s.
Yeah. Well, it was 60s and 70s and continued to the 70s. And the notion there is you wanted to get rid of coal-fired plants because they were polluting and creating sulfates that were reflecting light and causing global cooling. You also had acid rain at that time.
Yeah.
And again, get rid of the energy sector. And both of those turn out to be duds. And this global mean temperature metric, whatever it is, started increasing in the 70s. So they said, well, this won't go. And for a number of reasons, CO2 came into the issue. One of the reasons was the International Geophysical Year began a measurement program for CO2 at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And this was Charles Keeling, and it was promoted by a man called Roger Revelle, who was director at Scripps, which is an oceanographic institution in California. At any rate, they noticed CO2 has been increasing. And the evidence is it's been increasing since the industrial era began, but serious levels, at least measurable, were being reached in the 50s, 60s, where it was perhaps significant in terms of heating.
Why did they start measuring it?
Well, curiosity.
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
so they were just curious to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting chemical. It plays a role in photosynthesis. It's vital. We have, like 40,000 parts per million in our breath. So, it's an interesting substance. And part of the reason it's interesting is, of course, that it has infrared absorption, and so it plays a role in what is called the greenhouse effect. Okay, so they found it. And the question then was, what are the implications? But more than that, if you were interested in controlling the energy sector, is the fact that no matter how clean you made the burning of fossil fuels, you would inevitably be left with the product of clean burning, which was CO2.
I see, I see. So this was one...
You couldn't get rid of it.
Pollutant, I see. So
Not a
no matter how clean
pollutant.
the fossil fuel energy became, they were never going to get rid of carbon dioxide.
Just like...
So that was a good... Now, why do you think there was attempts to... You talked about control of the energy sector. Why bring that into it?
Well, I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but it obviously is at the heart of industrial development. It's the heart of the prosperity of the West. In 1988, when Jim Hansen gave testimony to the Senate about finding that there was global warming, and Newsweek had a cover, and the cover showed the Earth on fire and had the label, "All scientists agree."
Right.
Now, you had all sorts of funny problems at that time. Like most weathermen disagreed. And the American Meteorological Society decided they needed re-education. I mean, the march through the institutions was pretty effective. And we could talk about that. I mean, that's been...
Well, let's talk about this, because I was going to push back at you again, playing devil's advocate. So we hear all the time this idea that, 97% of scientists agree that climate change is real, which is different than saying that global warming is real, by the way. But 97% of scientists agree. And now we're hearing from Dr. Richard Lindzen, and he doesn't agree, but 97% of scientists do, so why the hell should we listen to Dr. Lindzen? And so let's start with the 97% of scientists agree claim.
But there are some issues where I think you could say there was 100% agreement. So, for instance, if you were to say CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and adding it will probably create some warming. I don't think too many people would disagree. I think the only thing would be how much, and many people would think it would be negligible, but no one would disagree with that. And so given this telephone game where you can say something perfectly innocent and the politicians can interpret it as saying, oh, so you agree that we'll have warming. And that warming, however small, they'll assume is the end of the world. Well, yeah, there's agreement. But it's not agreement with what they're ultimately claiming, that it's an existential threat. And you had, quote, thousands of the world's leading climate scientists, which is a field that probably had a few dozen, early in my career. And suddenly when you piled in the money, in the US, I think the increase with Clinton-Gore was maybe a factor of 15. You suddenly had thousands of, quote, climate scientists. Now, no one in my department claimed they were a climate scientist in 1990. Because, nobody, I didn't know everything about, paleoclimate. I didn't know how you assessed ice cores. I knew dynamics. I knew radiation. Other people knew other things.
Right.
But
it's not a field of specialization, climate science.
Right. I mean, it is the definitive interdisciplinary thing, and nobody has mastered all the disciplines. Trouble is when you increase the funding 15, and the condition for funding was supporting the narrative, that you then could get lots of people, all of them calling themselves climate scientists, and most of whom have not familiarized themselves with the physics and the chemistry and so on. So you have this idiocy of impacts. So, you've seen it, global warming and obesity, global warming and diabetes. I mean, anyone can get a piece of the action.
Okay, so if we close this off, and maybe we could do this, maybe you could take 30 seconds. We've got a lot of relatively young people watching this YouTube channel, and they're worried because they've been fed a non-ending diet of apocalyptic catastrophe and oppressive patriarchy since they were like 3. And so if you wanted to address them directly and say what you wanted to say about what we can expect over the next 50 years, let's say, because that's kind of not a bad lifespan viewpoint, or 75 years, what do you think, what should we be contemplating on the climate front?
Much the same as we've seen. You'll see variations. They've always occurred. There will be places like the Gulf Coast of the U.S., which had been a citrus country in the 40s and now is too cold for citrus. Other things will change. Things always change a bit. There may be, several inches of sea level rise, but not a lot more. There's no evidence it'll be much more. You'll still have a situation where if you live in New England, Mark Twain's remark, wait a minute and the weather will change, will still be true. And, that's life. That's why you have overcoats and gloves and swimsuits. And there'll be nothing special. It's not cataclysmic. You're not going to be inundated with hungry polar bears fleeing the Arctic. You're not going to have cities underwater. And, get on with your life. But the question is, if your teacher insists on your saying the world is coming to an end or you won't get promoted, I'm not sure what I should tell them.
I hope you found that interview of interest and of extreme importance in this fight against climate Marxism, and I encourage you to watch the entire 2-hour interview if possible. In any case, this brings us to the final stage in this subversion model, wherein all the above climate hysteria and deindustrialization madness becomes the normalized status quo, and even to the point wherein the duped citizens of these industrialized nations will be willing to submit to what is currently only being bandied about as impending climate lockdowns, but which can become a reality if the crisis stage warrants it. In 2022, the online news outlet The Hill described what these climate lockdowns could look like. They wrote, quote, "What would climate lockdowns look like? Most likely, cities and states would begin a gradual and discreet ramp-up of restrictions. During the early days of the COVID pandemic, millions of Americans work from home. This could become the permanent norm if special carbon tax are put in place. Such taxes could be imposed on companies, limiting driving or air miles, and extend to individual employees. Drive to work in a car, you get hit with the tax. Children could be impacted by climate lockdowns too. Schools, especially those influenced by teachers' unions, could impose permanent online-only days. While deaths from natural disasters have fallen by 2/3 over the past 5 decades, mostly thanks to technological innovations, elites insist that climate change is the biggest threat modern humans have ever faced. Climate lockdowns and other restrictions will be framed as saving the people of the United States and the world from themselves. What goal could be more noble?" Unquote. And so, while all this insanity and madness on the racial front is taking place, we also have climate Marxism being used on another front to demoralize, destabilize, and impoverish Americans through the deindustrialization of a once prosperous nation, and calling upon Americans to give up the American dream in the name of saving the planet from a greenhouse effect of CO2 that has resulted in a 15% increase in green foliage upon the Earth's surface over the past 2 decades, meaning that the world is literally a greener place than it was 20 years ago, resulting in a larger and much greener habitat for human flourishing around the world. But that good news is not part of the agenda of cultural Marxism and woke activism, and so don't look for this news to be widely reported or celebrated. Now, as Americans, these introductory episodes on cultural Marxism and woke activism are of extreme importance for understanding the political and social environment that we Latter-day Saints are caught up in. But as Latter-day Saints and Americans, we must also contend with the moral chaos and cultural madness of queer Marxism, which only adds another layer of demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization in the takedown of Western civilization from within, and if possible, the takedown of the church along with it, for the two are closely linked. Yes, I know we are promised that the church will never be taken from the earth again, but that does not mean that the church will be able to hold all its members together as it is currently constituted, for it is quite possible that this moral chaos and cultural madness will create a moral rift or cultural schism within the church itself. But let's end here for now, and in our next and final introductory episode, I will go on to explain the precarious and impossible position that the institution of the church and its Orthodox members have been placed in due to this queer Marxism, woke activism, and the ever-encroaching anti-discrimination laws which are threatening our religious freedom. Thank you for watching. Push the like button if you enjoyed this episode, and be sure to push the subscribe button. Until next time, consider the gravity of these perilous times, and remember that our children and grandchildren are depending on us to get this right, and to leave them a world wherein they at least have a fighting chance.